The Airbus versus Boeing debate has now been raging for decades, and not just between the manufacturers, but also between the pilots who fly them. Boeing pilots tend to just say that they fly real aircraft, while Airbus pilots usually respond by just pointing towards their comfy seats and tray tables with a smug smile on their face. But there is of course some serious points to this debate. So which plane maker actually makes the best and safest planes, and is there really a difference? Stay tuned. Airbus and Boeing aircraft actually differ in a lot of different design features that in most cases is only visible to the pilots and the engineers who work on them. To fully understand these differences, we really need to dive into some quite technical details here, and a really good place to start is with the fly-by-wire system. Up until as late as in 1995, this was not something you would find on Boeing aircraft, but it's been an integral part of Airbus's designs since back in the 1980s. Airbus's newer models are really built around this concept, and their use of the fly-by-wire system goes a lot deeper than just as a mechanism for moving flight control surfaces. So, what is fly-by-wire then, and how is it being used? Well, in short, it replaces manual flight controls with an electric interface. This means that when the pilots move their controls, in Airbus's case a side stick, then instead of that input being transmitted by hydraulics or old-school cables and rods, it is interpreted by flight control computers, which then send electronic signals to actuators who then adjusts the flight controls. So basically, from the pilot's point of view, when we pull up, then the nose will still go up, and when we push down, the nose will still go down, but it's what's going on in between that changes. Now, this has a lot of different benefits. To start with, fly-by-wire is much lighter and overall less bulky, and you can also relatively easily build in a lot of redundancy into it. On top of that, the fact that it requires less moving parts also means less maintenance, monitoring, and a lot less stuff that can break. So together, this all means that fly-by-wire is already a huge benefit in terms of cost, efficiency, and redundancy levels. But what does it actually mean for us, the pilots? Well, here is where some of the biggest differences between the Airbus and Boeing philosophies comes in. You see, the Airbus design philosophy focuses a lot on trying to reduce human error. Simply put, an Airbus is designed to fly for the pilot, protecting against human error, which means that the pilot role becomes more of a manager of the aircraft and its automatics. Now, this doesn't mean that Airbus are saying pilots always mess up, so let's replace them. Instead, their idea is more of human error is unavoidable, so what can we do to minimize its effects? Now, pilots who have grown up flying Airbus airplanes tend to absolutely love this because the aircraft really looks after them, and things like trimming away control forces have therefore become a thing of the past. And on top of that, Airbus planes also tends to be really smooth and precise to hand fly. Now, Boeing have also lately started embracing fly-by-wire in their most modern aircraft, but their design philosophy remains a little bit more traditional. Boeing's unofficial motto is "Pilots always have ultimate authority," and partly because of that, Boeing wanted their aircraft to still feel and behave like a proper airplane. So their fly-by-wire is designed to keep the feel and feedback of a conventional aircraft, always giving a tactile indication of what's going on. This means that if you get your hands on even the most modern current Boeing, the Boeing 787, you will still get a sense of aerodynamics and the motion of the aircraft when you hand fly it, and if you don't trim the aircraft when the speed or attitude changes, well then you will still definitely feel that. Like I said, this was a design choice where Boeing actively designed in the need for pilots to do that trimming as well as giving the feel of all of the conventional stick forces, even though they could have theoretically gotten rid of all of that. Because of this, Boeing have also kept that old big control column to grab onto, and all of this gives a real hands-on, directly in control kind of feeling, even though behind the scenes it's all design choices rather than something that is mechanically or physically needed. Airbus, on the other hand, not only removed the yokes in favor of side sticks, but also removed nearly all feedback and tactile cueing from their planes, encouraging their pilots to instead focus on what the instruments were telling them. And this is obviously what's causing Boeing pilots to say that their aircraft is all about real flying, whilst flying an Airbus is more about very small, precise hand movements and not over-controlling it, kind of like a computer game. The point I'm hoping to make here is that landing a Boeing 787 on a gusty airport with howling crosswinds will be a very different flying experience than landing an equivalent Airbus A350. One is more seat of the pants, making the aircraft do what you need, while the other is, according to some pilots, more like I said, a computer game. But that doesn't mean that it's any less challenging. I should also be really honest here and point out that I haven't flown an Airbus myself, so the comparisons that you're hearing in this episode are coming from some of my other colleagues. But I would really love to get my hands on an Airbus at some point. Now, there is obviously a lot more to this than just handling techniques. Fly-by-wire is not as simple as pilot input is turned into electric signal which results in a flight surface moving. And that's because the way that the electronic brain inside of the aircraft interprets those pilot inputs and what is then transmitted is subject to a lot of what we refer to as control laws. Now, I have talked about these in several of my videos over on the Mentour Pilot channel, and there was a lot of chatter about them in the press, especially after the terrible crash of Air France Flight 447. So, what are they and what role do they play? Well, I'll get back to that in just a few seconds, but one thing that I can tell you is that today's sponsor, Saily, plays a huge role in my comfort when I'm out traveling. There is literally nothing more irritating than being without internet when you really need it, but with Saily you will never have that problem again, no matter where you're traveling. Saily is a truly revolutionary eSIM app created by the tech wizards over at Nord, and those are people that we really trust here on the channel. With super affordable plans in over 150 countries, Saily makes it easy to truly stay connected globally without the hassle of physical SIM cards. Using it is incredibly straightforward. You just download the app, install your eSIM and activate your plan. And if you want a real pro tip, activate it before you take off. That way you're all set the moment you touch down. Now, Saily is compatible both with iOS and Android, and if you for whatever reason would run into any trouble, well then they have a 24/7 support available to help you. For me, Saily have been an absolute game changer whenever I go to countries where roaming doesn't work or is super expensive. And if you want to avoid travel headaches as well, then head over to saily.com/mentornow and use the code MENTORNOW for a 15% discount on your first purchase. Thank you, Saily. Now back to the video. Airbus pilots operate their aircraft in 3 possible control laws, or flight control modes, and simply put, these laws differ in how much the automation is doing behind the scenes when the pilot moves the side stick. For example, if the aircraft is fully functional, it will operate in normal law, but if basically anything from the inertial reference system, air data system, or the flight computers would degrade or fail in any way, well then the system will drop into something known as alternate law, where less protections are available to the pilots. And if those failures will then get even worse or affect certain critical systems, well then the aircraft protections will drop even further down and go into something known as direct law. Direct law means exactly what it sounds like. In this state, the pilot will be more or less directly moving the control surfaces with the side stick, basically how it works on normal, traditional aircraft. And this means no support from the aircraft for trimming, yaw damping, or really anything else. Now that might not sound that terrible, but it can come as quite a shock if you are suddenly thrown into it and you're not used to it, and that's worth remembering. But like I said, when everything is working as it should, well then the aircraft will be operated in normal law, which provides some truly awesome protections. In Airbus aircraft, these are known as hard protections, since they are non-overridable, which means that the protections can take priority over what the pilots want to do. Now it's important to point out that those protections only kick in if certain flight envelope parameters are exceeded, meaning that the aircraft is about to do something that it really shouldn't be. The rest of the time the system is instead working with more small and helpful inputs like trim adjustments, yaw damping, or help with holding a set attitude or bank angle, and This design is really innovative and makes for a very safe aircraft overall, since it addresses the human factors problem by physically preventing the pilots from causing the aircraft to go outside of its safe flying parameters. Let me give you an example. If the pilots make a mistake, like trying to roll into a too steep bank angle, well, then the aircraft will just correct it for them and roll back to a safe bank angle again. And no matter how much the pilots then wants to continue increasing that roll, the aircraft just won't let them do it. This also means that if the pilots would, for example, pull the thrust levels back whilst also pitching up in order to try and deliberately stall the aircraft, it also won't let them. And when I say it won't let them, I mean it physically won't let them. If the aircraft exceeds the unsafe angle of attack that it feels, the aircraft will then just drop its nose. And again, no matter how much the pilot tries to pull back on the side stick, that nose is still going to lower itself using its alpha floor protection. And even if the outer throttle is disconnected when this happens, the airplane will then just re-engage it again and throw on full power, locking it in until the speed is back to a safe value again, using another feature referred to as toga lock. But here also comes a pretty important detail, because it won't physically move the thrust levels when it does this toga lock feature, nor will it move the side stick when it intervenes, which is something that I am personally not a big fan of. You see, my experience is that pilots, especially when they're under stress, respond a lot quicker to combined visual and tactile stimuli if they need to quickly understand what the aircraft is actually doing. So a thrust lever in idle, which in reality is producing full thrust, is in my view not very helpful in re-establishing that crucial situational awareness, but we'll get back to that soon. Now, Boeing obviously have built-in protections for their pilots too, but these are what's known as soft protections. Those protections will warn the pilot if the flight envelope is about to be exceeded, and they will also even try to help correct it by applying some gentle inputs. But if the pilot insists in continuing the perceived dangerous maneuver, well then the aircraft won't stop them. So I guess you could maybe say that the Airbus protections looks after the pilots and the aircraft a bit more than Boeing's equivalent does, but are there any downsides with that? Can the automation ever look after the pilots a little bit too much? Well, one of the biggest criticisms about the Airbus design is that its advanced levels of automation and protections can actually take the pilot out of the loop in some situations. If they aren't paying close attention, pilots can lose track of what the aircraft or even what the other pilot is doing. Now, this might happen because of over-reliance, complacency, or a lack of understanding, and all of those factors played key roles in the crash of Air France Flight 447. Before that accident, there was a common misconception that an Airbus basically couldn't stall, which of course is utter nonsense. It's not like Airbus had found a way to defeat the laws of aerodynamics. Instead, like I explained before, the aircraft normally just wouldn't allow itself to get close to a stall if everything was functioning correctly. And the crew of Air France 447, whilst recognizing that they had issues with their instruments, didn't fully understand to which extent that had degraded the safety features of their aircraft, and therefore didn't recognize that the aircraft had actually entered into a fully developed stall. Now, even after the Air France 447 disaster, more accidents attributed to potential complacency, lack of understanding or mishandling of other Airbus aircraft have also occurred. But Airbus, of course, have highlighted that when flown appropriately, incidents like those just shouldn't happen. Airbus's golden rules are fly, navigate, communicate, and use the most appropriate level of automation at all times. So it's critical to point out that while Airbus aircraft do provide a lot of support, the pilots are still responsible for managing and monitoring what their airplane is doing. But another question is, could these high levels of automation and chances of the pilots getting out of the loop lead to a higher risk of startle factor for Airbus pilots, or at least make it worse? Well, it turns out, maybe. Let's look at S7 Airlines Flight 5220. This event shows how a rapidly escalating situation overwhelmed a crew that not only had the upset itself to deal with, but also had to adjust what they did depending on what the plane was doing. Don't worry, I'll explain it quickly now. This was a December flight back in 2021 in Siberia during heavy winter conditions, and before the flight, the aircraft, a new Airbus A321neo, was completely covered in snow, and during the de-icing, the airport crew only de-iced the wings and tail surfaces, not the actual fuselage. That was a problem, because in the Airbus, many of the air data sensors, meaning the pitot tubes and angle of attack vanes, sit below the windshield on either side of the cockpit. And because of this, Airbus had warned operators that ice and snow that wasn't removed from the front of the fuselage could instead get heated up by the windshield heat, melt and then trickle down to the sides of the fuselage, where it could then refreeze. Now, if this water was to freeze onto the air data sensors, that didn't necessarily mean a big deal, because these sensors have their own heating elements. But if the water froze in front of the pitot tubes, for example, forming vertical ridges, that would be a big problem. You see, the pitot tubes provide airspeed information among other things, but frozen ice ridges running top to bottom can disrupt the airflow of oncoming air that hits the pitot tubes, making their data unreliable. Again, this was something that Airbus had warned airlines about, and there is more detail to how this happened that I'm looking into more closely in the video that I made on the incident over on Mentour Pilot. But the point here is that this crew took off and then found themselves with 3 disagreeing airspeed indications whilst flying in instrument meteorological conditions, basically inside clouds and inside of moderate turbulence. Now, the aircraft, sensing that its air data was unreliable, initially went from normal law to alternate law, which I already explained removed some of the protections and limitations from the flight controls. The pilots soon noticed that, but in the confusion, these pilots still exceeded the limits in pitch and roll, despite knowing that they were in alternate law and that they would need to adhere to these limitations by themselves. And then it became even worse when the aircraft went into direct law, which the pilots did not notice at first. And one of the implications of this was that the aircraft would now not trim automatically anymore. Unfortunately, this happened when the Airbus was trimmed full nose up in a very steep climb. So when the pilots then pushed their side sticks forward to drop the nose, when the speed deteriorated, that actually initially worked, but when the aircraft picked up speed and the pilots neutralized their sticks in the pitch, the extreme trim setting of the horizontal stabilizer once again caused a violent pitch up moment. This trim situation then led to multiple movements, like a giant, terrifying roller coaster, until the pilots noticed that they were in direct law and finally managed to get some control back. Of course, I am oversimplifying this again. You can watch my full video on this event for more details later. But in this event, the pilots also made conflicting control inputs with their side sticks, which normally then leads to a dual input oral warning from the aircraft. But the problem is that in many situations, for example, if something crucial like a stall warning is sounding, the dual input warning might get a lower priority and not be given to the pilots at all. In this case, the 2 pilots were making complete opposite inputs, and the Airbus logic with the side stick is to sum the inputs from both pilots, effectively then cancelling them out. Now, if the side stick would have been active, meaning that the pilots could actually feel what the other pilot was doing, this likely wouldn't have gone as far as it did in this case. Now, for me, this clearly highlights how important it is to understand the laws and protections in an Airbus and being aware of how to handle the aircraft properly without them. But it also shows how easy it is that a lack of visual and tactile cues can quickly remove the pilots from the loop, making them fall behind the aircraft and then just making the situation even worse. So for a lot of pilots, these are 2 controversial debating points. Are more basic systems better, and thus being able to see what the other pilot is doing actually matter? Well, it wouldn't be fair to continue this debate without also looking at some incidents involving Boeing in order to compare. And for that, we need an example of a modern fly-by-wire system that leaves authority in the pilot's hands, and a really good example of this is the incident involving a Boeing 777 freighter which departed from New York back in 2020. The crew of this Southern Air Boeing 777 were passing 4,000 feet, climbing to 5,000 feet, when ATC handed them over to candidate departure. When the pilots checked in, they were given further instructions to proceed, but during the readback of those instructions, the pilot who was on the radio suddenly cried out "Stall," repeatedly on the frequency as their speed had dropped to just 216 knots. During the subsequent seconds, the plane lost 550 feet before finally starting to climb away again, and the whole event lasted less than 3 minutes. Now this might seem relatively minor, but a Boeing 777 stalling on departure is actually a huge deal. So what happened and how did the aircraft get into this situation? Well, there isn't a huge amount of info about this particular event because thankfully it ended safely, but a fully loaded 777 has a quite high minimum clean speed, meaning safe speed with the flaps retracted. So it is possible that they just retracted their flaps a little bit too soon, or that they had such small margins that with the climb, heading changes and other distractions, they just allowed the speed to reduce a little bit without noticing it. We can't know for sure. The only thing we know is that it did happen. But we can compare likely scenarios like how an Airbus would have dealt with a similar scenario. In normal law, as I explained, an Airbus just would not let the aircraft get even close to the stall speed. It has both speed and angle of attack protections, and in fact it can prevent the flaps from being retracted if the speed is not high enough to support it. And if this happened just because the speed was reduced a little bit too much, well, then an Airbus would have gone into alpha floor protection, lowering the nose and applying toga thrust to get out of it. So in normal law, and this is really key to understand, the aircraft just wouldn't allow itself to stall. Well, a Boeing can and occasionally does allow that, but obviously not without ample warnings and indications first. But then again, in a Boeing, you would have just needed to grab onto the yoke and the thrust levers, disengage the autopilot, and together with your instruments, you would feel what the aircraft was doing, and so would your co-pilot. So the getting out of the situation once you're in it might be easier. Hard to say. Anyway, I guess over-reliance, rusty hand flying and complacency can affect any pilots or any aircraft type, so it's something that we as pilots always have to be aware of. But that's fly-by-wire. We also have to look at other safety systems when we compare Airbus and Boeing. And here it turns out that Airbus also have some other systems that can really help the pilots out. Those include things like the ability to automatically fly an emergency descent or a traffic collision avoidance maneuver, but my personal absolute favorite is the backup speed scale, or BUS. That's a system which provides the pilots with an artificial kind of speed range on their primary flight display, which they can fly using pitch and power in case they lose all reliable other speed indication. It's absolutely brilliant. Both Boeing and Airbus also have lately installed super smart systems that advise pilots if they're about to land or take off on the wrong runway, if they're landing too far into a runway, or if their approach is not properly stabilized. These systems have different names in Airbus and Boeing, but they essentially do the same thing. They help improve the pilot's situational awareness and thereby avoiding mistakes being made in the first place. But what about when things go wrong in flight and the pilots find themselves having to deal with a big and potentially complicated technical problem? Which one of them are better then? Well, actually both manufacturers sport fairly similar systems on their most modern jets here. Boeing calls it ACAS and Airbus calls it ACAM. And ACAS stands for Engine Indicating and Crew Alerting System, while ECAM stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring. Both names are kind of self-explanatory. They provide useful information like engine parameters, but also monitors for failures in any of the aircraft systems, and if they detect something, they then provide electronic checklists to help the pilots fix them. Both systems provide different levels of alert, prioritizing them in terms of severity, and use color coding to show which items need to be carried out by the pilot or by the aircraft itself. Sure, there are some differences between them, but both do a good job, and if you understand one, you would most likely be able to use the other as well. But if you were to dig a little bit deeper and start looking at the information provided to the pilots, we do find another common complaint though, and maybe not the one you think it will be. You see, Airbus actually give their pilots a lot more information than Boeing does, which kind of contradicts the "you got it" versus "we'll do it for you" attitude between the two manufacturers. If we have a look at the system displays that the pilots can actually see, it gives a quite good example. In Boeing, it is nothing more than a simplified visual overview of the basic setup. Boeing's manuals even emphasize that this overview should not be used for determining failures or fixes outside of what the checklist is telling them to do. But in the Airbus, the synoptic display is instead exactly that, an accurate display of the systems and all their values, connections and functioning levels, which can be used for troubleshooting and to build a better picture of what is going on. And when you head into the actual manuals, an Airbus FCOM, the Flight Crew Operating Manual, which contains the vast majority of type-specific procedures and system guidance, it is actually double, if not triple, the length of a Boeing equivalent. And this becomes a big factor when running complex problem-solving processes, because Airbus pilots can have multiple layers of information to get to grips with, while Boeing only have the bare minimum needed. So a really common complaint for Airbus pilots who then move over to Boeing is that there isn't enough information, while Boeing pilots who move over to Airbus often say that while it's intuitive and looks after you, it is often overly complicated and there's just too much information to go through. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think is better here, but these are exactly the kind of discussions that I often have with my Patreons when we have our live Zoom hangouts. And if you want to join one of those, then there's a link in the description below where you can sign up. Anyway, what about safety statistics then? Do they set one apart from the other? Well, actually what we can see when we look at the statistics is that Generation 4 aircraft, those are the ones that have higher levels of automation, like all Airbuses from the Airbus A320 family and later, as well as the Boeing 777 and the Boeing 787, they are just considerably safer than earlier designs. Loss of control in-flight accidents, these are the ones where nothing was actually wrong with the aircraft but control was still lost due to mishandling, are a full 90% lower in fourth than in third generation models. And that is primarily thanks to the safety benefits of fly-by-wire, modern systems and flight envelope protections. So essentially, when you start digging into overall safety statistics, there is actually no significant safety difference between a modern Airbus and a modern Boeing at all. What this means is that ultimately, whether a pilot prefers one over the other mostly comes down to personal preference and, of course, the training. A well-trained pilot should know the features of their aircraft and understand the benefits and limitations of its design, and a well-trained pilot will be safe in any type of aircraft. Now, as a pilot, you might prefer one feature to the other or take pride in operating the newest, biggest or coolest aircraft, but at the end of the day, safety is always what really matters. And if we look at events where pilots really save the day, like the Hudson ditching or TACA Flight 110 for example, these fantastic outcomes nearly always comes down to experience, a cool head and great handling skills. Not if the aircraft had a nice dinner table or not. So, which one do you prefer and why? Let me know in the comments here below and make sure that you subscribe and leave a like when you're down there. Now, if you're a flight simmer or just interested in aviation in general and you would like to learn how to properly operate the Boeing 737 by me and Ben from Airline Pilot Performance, well, we have put together a truly awesome course for you, and you can find the link to the course in the description below or by scanning this QR code. Now, you can do this course at your own pace. It's suitable for everyone and you won't find anything else like it out there, I can promise you that. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.